Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the WEFI Lecture Series. We're happy to have Ramana and Nanda here to present some work and give us some thoughts about where the future of the research area is going. Before that, let me get some logistics out of the way. So we're going to do the somewhat standard format. He'll pause every once in a while, see if there are any questions. If you have any clarifying questions, feel free to use the chat. Song and I will be monitoring that. If there's something really unclear, we'll try to interrupt. But otherwise, we suspect there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. And if anything is unclear, also things will be recorded. So with that, let me just introduce Ramana. So Ramana is a visiting professor of entrepreneurial finance at Imperial College and also the Seraphim Rock Professor of Business Administration at Harvard, where he's on leave right now. His research examines financing frictions facing new ventures with an aim to help entrepreneurs with fundraising and shed light on how intermediaries, corporate R&D, and policymakers can improve the odds of commercialization of the best technology in the economy. I could, of course, given he's my co-author, spend a lot of time highlighting Ramana's work, not the ones I work with him on, but I'll use my limited time to highlight two that I think are really representative of his impact on the field, which is vast. So first, he's got a great paper with Matt Rhodescroft, Financing Risk and Innovation. It's a great example of a paper where there's both a model and data, and it provides unique connections between capital markets, innovation, and one of the topics at the heart of today's lecture, experimentation. I think this paper is really reoriented how the field's thinking about learning and innovation, financing design, and investor strategy. More recently, he's got some work with Josh Luhr and the JEP, where they studied venture capital's role in financing innovation. And I think this is a great demonstration of Ramana's ability to condense complex trends and empirical results into a cohesive narrative. And this is, of course, a great skill for a co-author, but also helpful as we look to next steps in the field. So Ramana's always been generous with his time, with me at least, and as a young faculty member looking for wisdom, he's been an excellent listener. I want to thank him for showing that generosity again with his time today. And I ask you all to, instead of him listening to us, we're going to listen to him as he provides some important insights on the field. So Ramana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mike, for that overly generous introduction. Really appreciate it. Let me just share my screen and I'll let's get started. All right. Can you see the screen okay? All good? Great. Excellent. Okay, so thank you, Mike and Song and Yael and David for inviting me to speak today. This is an area that is, I guess, dear to my heart, and it was a really nice opportunity for me to take a little bit of time to collect my thoughts on where I feel a lot of this work has come and where I think some of the places, exciting places will be that it can go. So one of the, I guess, benefits that I've had is that I've straddled a little bit the finance and the strategy / entrepreneurship worlds. And this is an area that has been active in both of those areas. And so I will try and connect a little bit of the dots, talk about where things have been progressing in these different literatures, but then hopefully in the end kind of give some thoughts about how I think many of these can perhaps come together with some very interesting potential research ideas. Okay, and then as Mike said, please, if you have clarifications, questions, just jump in and kind of raise your hand or shout. But otherwise, if there's a bunch of other questions, I'll keep stopping and asking if there are questions along the way. Okay, so as I was reflecting on kind of even the term experimentation, it occurred to me that there's just lots of different definitions and interpretations out there. And I could kind of think of at least three. There might be others. So the first is more of this sort of cross-sectional view of trial and error experimentation, which is often kind of thought of in regards to perhaps centralized or decentralized systems. You know, do you let 1,000 flowers bloom, or do you kind of go one by one? The second is the experimental method itself, which obviously is used within economics and management to generate causal inference, but is also increasingly used by say tech companies and others, entrepreneurs, for testing whether they should, you know, whether the customer likes their product or not. And that will be, you know, I'll talk a little bit about how that's relating to some of the things we'll talk about today. But the third one, and the one that I'm going to sort of focus on my time, is really going to be an approach to learning under uncertainty. Okay, and so that's sort of the definition that I'd like you to have in mind as we think about experimentation today. That's not to say that either of these definitions is not relevant or important, or even may interact with this main one that I want to talk to you about today, but is just to kind of fix ideas about where I'll be going, and therefore also what I'm probably will not be putting as much emphasis on in today's discussion. Okay, so, you know, what is this idea of learning through experimentation? Why is it a valuable and important idea? I think it's sort of particularly important in contexts where sort of two things are present. The first is that the eventual returns of a project are uncertain, and that's certainly true of innovation and entrepreneurship, where they're not only uncertain but often also highly skewed. So, you know, most things fail and a few of them are very, very successful. And then the second element where this sort of mode of learning becomes important is where information about the likelihood of a project succeeding or the value of the project conditional on success is going to arrive with investment into the project. So you have to put some money in, you have to invest, you have to, you know, generate a cost in order to be, so you have to sort of expend a cost in order to generate the information or to learn. Okay, and so in that sense, I would characterize this as sort of ex post learning, as distinct from something like ex ante learning, which one might call analysis. Okay, so if I want to launch a product, I can do a lot of analysis. I can, you know, figure out what the demographics of the customer base are, how many people are there in different age groups, and what is the buying power that they have, and there's a bunch of things I can do kind of in terms of ex ante learning. But if I want to figure out whether, you know, the 40 to 55-year-olds are going to like my product, I'm going to have to make the investment to actually launch the product in order to truly learn whether, you know, my hunch that this was going to work is actually true. Okay, so no amount of sort of analysis is going to get me beyond a certain point. I need to actually kind of conduct the experiment and to learn in that sense. Okay, and so that's sort of the dynamic perspective as opposed to the sort of the cross-sectional let 1,000 flowers bloom sort of view of experimentation. And I think the other thing to note is that oftentimes, at least conceptually, people are thinking about the fact that the information that's generated from an experiment then informs some relevant action, which may in fact also include, you know, further learning through experimentation. Okay? And so, for example, should I continue investing in a project, or should I abandon? Oftentimes, my next investment could be thought of as another experiment that I'm conducting. Okay, so, you know, I'll just spend 2 minutes to sort of just kind of give some empirical facts that are consistent with this idea that, you know, the eventual returns of the project are highly uncertain, and you need to sort of put money in to be able to learn. This is just some data that I have from a large and successful venture capital firm that invested, say, $1 billion over a period of time, about a 10-year period of time before we wrote this paper. And all it's showing is sort of the share of the investments that fall into these 5 buckets versus the share of the gross returns coming from these buckets. And if there were, say, for example, if there were 100 projects that they had invested in, then you could see that essentially 61 or 62 of these projects were terminated, at or below the cost of the investment, and over half of the gross return came from something like 5 projects that were incredibly successful. Okay? And so that is, while this is data from one individual venture firm, I think a lot of our understanding now from a lot of different places suggests this is quite representative of the return distribution. And so you can see that there's sort of massive uncertainty and also very skew returns. And this just sort of has the data from the partnerships. We had the data on the votes that the partners had for these different investments at the time of the first investment. And you can see that, there is a distribution of scores, and that distribution is not very different for the ones that, ultimately failed versus those that were, quite successful. And so that just sort of reinforces the notion that these are, extremely uncertain, extremely risky types of investments they're making, and part of what they're going to do as a way to try to learn is to engage in experimentation. Okay, so in the next about an hour or so, I want to sort of talk to you about 2 main areas, and then a little bit on new frontiers based on time. The first area I want to talk to you is sort of 2 canonical approaches to conceptualizing experimentation. And I think this is helpful because, as you'll see, and as I noticed as I was reflecting on this later, a lot of the work that we know in this area kind of falls into one of these 2 broad ways of conceptualizing experimentation. And so it's just helpful to understand kind of what it is that each of these brings to the table. Okay, so the first one is a sort of a learning and stopping type of model, where you're a principal or an agent, or an investor, an entrepreneur that wants to decide whether to continue making investments into a project, or whether you should stop that investment. And importantly, usually in these ways of thinking about it, there is a single path. And there is sort of a projected outcome if that path is successful. And my goal is to try to understand, should I continue going or should I stop? There's another conceptualization of experimentation, which is really about trying to choose which path to go down. And it's often couched in a framing of, should I explore or exploit? And it's often kind of modeled through these multi-arm bandit problems, and so we'll have a chance to kind of think a little bit about the subtle distinctions that come from these 2 different ways of thinking about or conceptualizing experimentation. And then the sort of the next set of time that I hope to spend is really thinking about the application of these broad ideas of how to conceptualize experimentation into sort of 4 broad areas within the entrepreneurship innovation literature. The first is one that kind of looks at optimal contracts between principals and agents, particularly when the agent is engaged in innovation. The second broad area is going to look at frictions to financing experimentation, and how that might impact the trajectory of where innovation ends up being realized. The third is, I think, a new and very exciting area around entrepreneurial decision-making and entrepreneurial strategy that is related to these ideas. And then finally, there's a very large literature on kind of a strategic experimentation within economics. But there are some instances of how we've sort of seen those applied in the context of innovation, where you're really trying to learn from the actions of others. So you're thinking about information spillovers to yourself and how the actions of others might be impacting your own decision to experiment. Okay, and then as I said, I think there's these, what seems interesting and exciting is that, for example, a lot of these tools and methods are very related to actually the tools and methods that are in computer science. So if you think about, bandit problems are just an integral part of machine learning today. And so as we think about the role of machine learning both as a conceptual approach, but also literally as a way to do empirical research, I think there's some exciting areas where we can bring together computer science, economics, finance, strategy, and really kind of think about decision-making, entrepreneurial decision-making in a more structured way, which I think has a lot of promise. Okay, so I'll just stop here for a second and see if there's any questions, and then if not, I'll continue. All right, Mike, good to go? For some reason, I can't hear you, but I can see you nodding.
We're good to go.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to start with sort of these two approaches to conceptualizing experimentation. I'm going to keep it, everything is going to be very high level and kind of just more at the conceptual level. And there's a lot of technical stuff that I can refer to you to if you're really interested in getting into the subtleties of the models. Okay, so sort of the first approach to thinking about experimentation is a simple, should I continue or stop investment? Okay, and really a lot of this has emerged within the context of thinking about venture capital often, and the research is just really kind of thinking about, I invest at each stage, I generate information about the ultimate prospects for an innovation or new venture, and then I need to decide whether to continue or to abandon. Okay? Now, the important thing is that, and this is related to the literature on real options and investment under uncertainty, is that the option to abandon has, essentially has value, and that value that comes from the option to abandon even might allow you to start investments that you might not have started in an all or nothing bet. Okay, and so not only does staged financing kind of allow you to learn in steps, but by being able to abandon an investment along the way, it may also allow you to start things that you wouldn't have started otherwise. Okay, and so just to kind of give you a super simple kind of example, imagine an all or nothing bet where you can, get $1 billion with a 1% probability or 0 with 99% probability. The expected value of that bet is $10 million. And so if you had to pay $11 million for it, it would be a negative NPV investment. Now, on the other hand, if you have the opportunity to, run an experiment that might give you some intermediate information about whether or not this project is going to work, and then you invest the $11 million, note that the unconditional probability of making it to $1 billion is still 1%, so 10% times 10%. Okay, but the fact that you have this experiment along the way actually makes this a potentially NPV positive investment, because you can see that at this point, the sort of the expected value of this is $100 million, 10% chance of $1 billion, and 90% of 0. An $11 million investment into that makes it an $89 million sort of pre-money value investment in some sense. And so you would be willing to invest up to $8.9 million to fund this experiment. Okay? And so although you weren't willing to put $11 million into this all or nothing bet, you were willing to spend almost $20 million, the 8.9 plus the 11 in this particular example. And the reason for that is that when you get the negative intermediate results, you have the option to abandon. Okay, so the option to not invest $11 million 90% of the time is so valuable to you that you're willing to pay $8.9 million to learn whether there is a 10% chance that this is going to work. Okay, and so that's just and essentially that's one way of conceptualizing experimentation. Is I'm going to run an experiment, I'm going to get some information. If it's good, I will reinvest. If it's bad, I will abandon, and that abandonment option is very valuable to me. Okay, so the second kind of broad way of thinking about experimentation is these, they're called multi-arm bandit problems. And the central tension that they have here is one between exploration and exploitation. And so you can see why they're naturally very appealing and intuitive for thinking about innovation. And then, the sort of the term itself stems from Bayesian decision models, and the reason they're called that there are these arms is that you had these slot machines where you could put some money and then you could pull the arm and it would kind of tell you whether you won or not. And so you want to kind of picture someone who walks into a casino. There's all these machines that are there. I believe the reason they're called bandits is because they have negative expected value for you as the player, and so essentially they're thieves, and so that's why they're bandits. And so you get the one-armed bandit is when you pull that one arm, but you have a choice as a person in the casino to basically decide, should I choose this one or the other ones when I don't know what the reward probabilities are. And so I could spend time exploring and understanding all the various reward probabilities, or I could pick one and just continue pulling that one. And obviously you can see there's a trade-off here. I have sort of a fixed amount of resources. I need to maximize my expected gain, and I need to figure out a strategy that will allow me to optimize the trade-off between kind of exploring and understanding what the range of reward probabilities are across these bandits. But on the other hand, I also, once I find something that seems reasonably good, I want to start exploiting it because chances are that might be the one that could maximize my gain. And so, I'm sorry?
Is there a question?
Okay, no, I think that might have just been someone who's hot mic. All right, but this is nevertheless a good time for me to stop and check if there is a question. All right, I'll keep going. All right, so at the back of your mind, you have this sort of learning and stopping model, which is just about should I continue or stop. And then you have these bandit models where you're kind of thinking about should I go down one path or another path, and oftentimes one is an exploration path and the other is an exploiting path. Okay, and so now we'll sort of spend a little bit of time essentially talking through these ideas within the context of the entrepreneurship and the innovation literature. Okay. So, but I'm kind of going somewhat in chronological order, though not quite exactly. But I would say that a lot of the initial theoretical work in this area was really kind of looking at agency conflicts in the innovation process, and oftentimes from the perspective of the principal, and kind of thinking about how can the principal set either a contract that can be optimize innovation or returns from the principal standpoint, or how can the principal make sure that the agent is exerting effort on the right kinds of activities in order to generate information. Okay, And in many ways, the principal-agent conflict is quite similar. So, essentially, you have an investor, you have a principal, they need to decide whether to continue financing or shutting down an investment. The agent can divert effort to activities that give it, private benefit. And I, as a principal, need to figure out, how can I write a contract, or how can I structure a security that will generate good outcomes for me. And typically, the trade-off, not always, but typically the trade-off that ends up being examined in a lot of these models is that on the one hand, you want to reduce shirking by the agent. So, and that's sort of the very classic pay-for-performance literature is that, you kind of want to make sure that the agent doesn't shirk. And so you want to think about, the wedge between what you're measuring and what you're paying for is not too great. But on the other hand, the one difference here is that innovation is inherently risky. It's not necessarily going to succeed. And so when you see failure as a principal, you don't know whether the agent was shirking and just kind of goofing off, or whether you had an agent who genuinely tried to explore, but kind of failed for good reasons, i.e., nature came back with a bad a bad draw, but it wasn't the agent's fault necessarily that they were choosing to go off and explore. Okay, and so oftentimes there is this tension that exists, which is if I tend to focus too much on the short term, then the agent will try to do things that will generate returns for them in the short term. They may end up window dressing. They may end up kind of not actually choosing to explore as much because it's riskier for them. And so the key insight that kind of comes out from a lot of this work is that you want to make contracts less sensitive to the short-term outcome. And you really want to think about how you can align incentives with the agent to maximize value for the principal, often by focusing on the long-term outcomes of the project. Okay, and so I think Gustavo Manso's paper on motivating innovation is really the one that we often go to, and rightly so, as the sort of the first to articulate this insight. But I would say that there's other theoretical models out there as well that kind of have the same flavor, where what you're really trying to do is to think about making your contracts less sensitive to what's happening in the intermediate stage and really more focused on what's happening on the long-term outcome. Okay, so for example, Corneli and Yosha have a nice paper on security design, where they are kind of thinking about, should I, what's the optimal, to what extent should I be using convertible securities? And one of the nice elements of convertible securities in their model is that it essentially aligns the incentives of the agent with the principal, so that they don't end up kind of trying to do window dressing in the short term in order to be able to try to basically fool the VC. Okay, so now on the empirical front, there's obviously been a lot of really work, a lot of interesting, good work that has documented how tolerance for early failure by a principal can lead to more innovation. And I've just kind of put here 4 papers. This is by no means meant to be exhaustive, but it kind of gives you a sense of the spread of areas where people have done work. People have looked at kind of bankruptcy laws and how that might impact innovation. This paper by Gustavo himself and Pierre Azoulay and Josh Graf-Ziffen looks at the careers of HHMI investigators. So the HHMI program is one that it tends to kind of give their PIs a lot more freedom to go off and do what they want, and they're not kind of focused on short-term grant writing and constantly having to justify their existence with their grant makers, and they sort of show that this is really associated with when you kind of match them to other people who are of equivalent quality but did not get HHMI grants. Their research is much more innovative. It's more highly cited. It's more and it's not as incremental. Okay. Tian and Wang have a paper looking at a sample of VC-backed IPOs, and they find that, you know, conditional on this firm having been IPO'd, the VCs that had kind of more failure tolerance, or the startups that were backed by VCs that had greater failure tolerance, are more innovative. And similarly, we have work looking at you know, the tenure of CEOs and the degree to which they are willing to take kind of long-term views and really think about innovation within the companies. Okay. Now, as we kind of think about further work in this area, what I want to kind of highlight is I think two interesting boundary conditions, or I guess there's two elements of this model that I think are probably not as well understood as maybe we should think about. And so I would love to see more work done in this area. Okay? So the first is that, remember, all of this literature is really about optimal contracting. And so what it's saying is that an optimal contract can exhibit tolerance for failure, okay? But it need not. And in fact, you know, Gustavo himself in the paper notes that the effects of termination on incentives for exploration are ambiguous. So in fact, there will be conditions where excessive termination or continuation may be optimal to motivate exploration. Okay. Now, I think obviously the catchy element really to this paper was this key insight, which is what made it different from traditional work, which is that you want to think about, you know, you can have situations where failure tolerance will impact innovation, but it turns out that you can have situations where, at least theoretically, excessive termination can engineer innovation. Okay, and so I would love to kind of see the extent to which these boundary conditions are being explored to really understand, you know, what are can we learn a little bit more about the depth of this model or these class of models to really kind of understand under what conditions it's tolerance for failure, and under what conditions or empirically can we see situations where actually excessive termination might actually engineer more innovation. Okay. The second area that I think is quite interesting is that, again, this is sort of an optimal contract, and so the principal is optimizing their contract with each agent based on the specific elements of the parameters in this model. Now, obviously, we can't always optimize contract by contract. Okay, so we may need to have a policy. We may have a policy like we say, our tenure clock is 6 years, or our tenure clock is 9 years. Okay. Now, when I say my tenure clock is 9 years versus 6 years, yes, I have tolerated more failure, but it does mean that, you know, there will be people for whom that 9-year clock is not the optimal contract, and there will be people for whom the 6-year tenure clock is not the optimal contract. And similarly for HHMI, and similarly for things like bankruptcy laws. You can't have a specific bankruptcy law for each company that is going bankrupt. And so I think understanding how the sort of these policies have a bearing on innovation will be very interesting, because there's sort of both a treatment effect, but then there's a selection effect here that we, I think, are not necessarily thinking about as much, which is that, you know, if I choose to have if I have a 10-year horizon, I'm going to hire CEOs that will have a 10-year horizon. Well, I'm going to probably, as a board, select different types of CEOs to take that position, than if I had a tenure horizon of 5 years. And moreover, because these are often two-sided markets, the people who will choose to match with me might be different when I give tenure horizons rather than 5-year ones. Okay. Note that when you're thinking about an optimal contract, all of this selection versus treatment has already been dealt with in the model. But the challenge comes when you can't optimize contract by contract, then you actually get kind of averages, right? And the averages will determine the kinds of people that you have in the population will determine what you end up going one way or another. Okay, so let me stop there again and see if there's any questions.
I don't see anything. You're being crystal clear, I suppose.
Has a question.
There we go.
Hey, Ramana. I was just wondering whether has anyone used these kind of models to think about whether you organize innovations in-house or outsource it to a separate company. So there seems to be another thing that sort of happens in, that in pharmas, outsourcing the research basically to biotechs and using that organization. Well, it's sort of a different way of thinking about the different contracts, I guess.
Absolutely. So, I think there's a few different elements. I would say that, Amit Seru has a paper on kind of, incentives for innovation around the boundaries of the firm. So that's kind of one theory. And that's, again, related to this idea, which is that when I fear that my resources might be taken away from me, I can't commit to long-term innovation, and that may change the way I think about investing in innovation. There's another paper by Ilan Gensch and David Sharfstein, which it's I think it's like a permanently unpublished working paper. I have a feeling, but it's a very nice paper. Which kind of looks at it's a little bit related to this this sort of shirking versus the not shirking idea, where they look at entrepreneurs, they look at biotech companies that have a single drug and compare those to large pharma companies. And they find that biotech companies that have a single drug are more likely to make it through phase 1 clinical trials, but conditional on making it to phase 2 are more likely to fail. Okay? And so it seems as if the entrepreneur has these private benefits of control. They want to interpret the information kind of more positively on the margin, and perhaps they want to do that because they're like a one drug company. If they shut down, they lose their private benefits of control. Whereas on a pharma company, maybe this is an employee, so they get redeployed to another position, so they're more willing to kind of tell the truth, as it were. So I think there's different.
I was thinking about it a bit like when you said you can't optimize contract by contract, right? That
yes
might be particularly true within an organization. So
yes,
if you want to have
that's right.
If you have a lot of heterogeneity in the pay in your structure of your different R&D people, might not be kind of feasible, for example. Could be one story for outsourcing, I guess.
I think that would be a great. I don't know that there has been a paper written on exactly that idea. If I'm wrong, please. Oh, there you go. Mike has said here is a paper related to Per's question. So Mike always knows the literature better than I do. So there we go. Okay, so so the second area that I'm going to talk a little bit about now is around the costs and constraints to financing experimentation. And what I'm going to emphasize here is that this is even with symmetric uncertainty. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of work that I've just spoken about, which is related to asymmetric information between the principal and the agent. But this is just even saying, let's imagine there's symmetric uncertainty. Even the entrepreneur really doesn't know to a first order, will this vaccine for COVID actually work? Or, when will we have flying cars, come on the horizon, or, whatever it might be. Yes, there is asymmetric information between entrepreneurs and investors, but symmetric uncertainty is a big deal too. And so let's try to think about, just kind of holding all of that, the asymmetry, keeping it out of the way. Can we think about costs and constraints to financing experimentation? Okay. So, this is an area that I'm particularly enthused about. So apologies, I'm going to probably have like one extra slide on this relative to what I probably should have. But this is kind of showing you global venture capital investment over the last decade, okay? And you can see that it's gone up like 5-fold. And what's interesting is that it's really been driven by growth in IT software and services, consumer products and services, business products and services, financial services, to some extent healthcare, but on a relative basis, healthcare hasn't kept up with all of those. Okay, and then if you think about things like IT hardware and energy, materials, and resources, these have just really not moved in absolute dollar terms over the last decade. And so one, question that you might ask is, could some of these patterns be shaped by the cost of early experiments across these sectors? Okay, and so, in particular, one thing that we know happened was that cloud computing came along in the sort of the mid 2000s. With the advent of Amazon Web Services, and that really kind of lowered the cost of learning and early experiments in some sectors, but not others. Okay, and so Mike Ewens and co-authors have a paper that basically shows that when you lower the cost of experimentation, what this does is it kind of increases the option value of those particular projects. And what that allows is it allows more of these long shot bets to be founded. And so what you might find is that you may have more failure, but on the other hand, if you're successful, you will have higher step-ups. Okay, and so this idea that you might have more long shot bets being founded and a much larger number of firms being founded in these particular sectors where it's become cheaper to experiment is an intriguing one, but it doesn't kind of necessarily speak to the fact that why we may have kind of under provision of capital in certain sectors. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting question to try to understand whether we have true frictions here. So is it the case that it's just too prohibitive to learn about the viability of the ultimate viability of these kinds of technologies relative to others? And is that kind of what might be driving a little bit of the under provision of capital to these kinds of companies? Okay, and if so, what can be done to reduce these frictions, right? And so if we want to have more innovation in nuclear power, and it takes $4 billion to run a minimum viable product for a nuclear startup, how do we figure out how we get more innovation in nuclear energy if we really care about climate change and believe that nuclear power is part of the debate when we're thinking about baseload power, clean baseload power? Okay, and I think one and to that point, I think one thing that I want to sort of emphasize a little bit is that people often talk about the capital intensity of some sectors being high relative to others. And I would contend that if one is kind of thinking about this question, you want to think about it as as the capital intensity required to learn rather than the capital intensity required to grow or scale or whatever it might be. Okay? And so this is an incomplete picture on Airbnb's financings up till its Series F round of financing. But you can see it raised $2.9 billion and then it raised more money subsequently. And so this is a company that was not capital light per se, but it was pretty capital light at the de-risking stage. Okay, and so you can see that Y Combinator, they put, essentially Y Combinator put in $20,000 and bought 6% of the company. So the post-money valuation at the time was, $333,000. And then essentially 3 months later, they raised a round of financing from Sequoia with $600,000 at a $2.4 million pre-money valuation. So that's a 7 times 2 step up in value. And then less than a year later, they raised a 31 times step up in value. Okay. Now, I don't want to claim that that there's no hubris here or whatever, but the general point that I would like to sort of leave you with is that these kinds of step ups in value, if you think about it from an economic standpoint, come from the fact that your prior is that this is just not going to work, okay, and that it's going to fail. And it turns out it didn't fail. It turned out it actually worked. So you update your priors considerably. And because you update your priors considerably, you have a massive step up in value. And so the idea is that in many of these kinds of software companies, you get these crazy long shot bets. Like, who would have thought that you could take a company where people sleep on each other's, bedroom floors on mattresses and turn this into a, several billion-dollar company? Actually, not very many people at all. Okay, but when it turns out that people are willing to do this and that they're doing this in New York and they're doing it in San Francisco and they're doing it in Tokyo, you're like, okay, I understand now. I have seriously updated my priors and I'm going to have massive step ups in value. Okay, so it doesn't matter that I raised as Airbnb $2.9 billion, because all of that money came once I was already valued at essentially $1.2 billion. So I can keep raising billions of dollars at that valuation, and I'm just not going to get diluted. And in fact, just to make that point, Y Combinator came in with 6%. And after $3 billion were raised, they were still only diluted down to 3%. Okay, so only 50% dilution after $3 billion. The only point here is it's not capital intensity per se, it's the cost of learning that I think is driving a lot of this. When it comes to, so as we think about the cost of learning, that's clearly one kind of potential driver that might kind of think about where we see the financing of innovation. But there's sort of 2 others where I would think that, it will be interesting to devote more time and attention. The first has to do with investment cycles and innovation. There's specialization across the capital supply chain, so that leads investors to have to coordinate across time because no investor typically has the ability to take a company through to cash flow positive. And so that kind of opens up the question, does the risk of limited future financing impact what early stage investors choose to finance in booms and downturns? And that is, a little bit of the work that Mike referenced at the start, where Matt and I have some work looking at the role of financing risk and how VCs appear to change systematically the kinds of companies they're willing to finance projects with more option value during hot markets and less option value during downturns, leading to potentially more junk being funded in boom times, but also more transformational things being funded at those times as well. Okay, and then finally, this just goes back to policies around failure tolerance. We know that different VCs have different reputations. Sequoia has a reputation for being incredibly quick on the trigger, okay? And others like Greylock or others might have like reputations for being, super patient. And the question is, in equilibrium, how do these kinds of VCs exist in the ecosystem? What drives selection into these kinds of VCs? It's a little bit, like the Chicago economics PhD program versus the MIT economics PhD program. Chicago will take lots of people, and at least that was the reputation. I don't know what it is now, and sort of counsel out a large share of them after their first or second year, so they're exercising their option value. Whereas MIT will say, we commit to taking you all the way through. Well, if I commit to taking you all the way through, I'm going to have to choose a different kind of person than if I'm willing to take a bet on you and say, look, come try it out. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't, you can leave in 2 years. And so how do we think about these policies in a bit to try to, portray yourself as being founder friendly and failure tolerant? Does it actually change the kinds of investments you make? Okay. I'll stop here again for a quick break to see if there's any questions here.
Nothing in the chat, but if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute.
So I have just, I guess maybe there is literature on this, but if you're going to have these projects where you have to experiment several stages before these things come to fruition, doesn't that pose potentially a conflict with the time horizon of typical VC funds?
Yes, so I agree. I think as we go here, I think that cost is a reduced form way of thinking about both money and time. But you could say that the amount of time it takes to learn is so large relative to what I'm willing to devote that it becomes prohibitively costly for me to engage in that experimentation. And I would completely concur with you on that. But the only thing I'll say is
another story you hear about like cloud computing and so forth, right, is that it enables the ventures to go on for longer and experiment, using their own bootstrap or angel financing and stuff like that before they go to VCs, I guess.
Yeah, the irony though is that it appears as if VCs are getting involved earlier in the life of companies with this, right? So I don't think this is coming from the fact that they're living a longer life before they get VC funded. And I also don't think it's that, look, a lot of these super successful unicorns have been private for a very, very long period of time. And Mike has another paper with Joanne, a really nice paper looking at how companies are staying private for very long. And so again, it's kind of like they don't seem to complain about it when these companies are staying private for very long. Somehow it doesn't make a difference to their timelines. And so I kind of feel like part of it must be the fact that it's because they're putting money in at this stage. This is the point where it's taking time and money rather than here, which is the difference when it comes to a nuclear power plant or a battery technology or whatever. So that's your old hand, right, Per?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I was thinking about in this context too is just a sort of interesting thing about these issues in a broader kind of organizational context, right? Where I guess you do see some big long-term capital-intensive projects being carried out in the economy, but they tend to be carried out inside established firms.
Correct.
Rather than in startups. So it sort of comes back to this. It's sort of interesting to think about how kind of innovative activity is divided between established firms and startups, depending on the kind of projects. And then maybe there's a hole somewhere, some kind of projects that never get any financing.
That's right. So I mean, I think that and this really takes us to the sort of the promising areas discussion, which is that we know that the incentives and the organizational structures and the ways in which people select and advance new ideas are quite different within, with arm's length kinds of contracts and inside the company contracts. And so if we believe that VC has been the sort of the provider of risk capital for radical innovation, and we don't see that happening in certain areas, then the question becomes, is that being adequately filled by the others? Are there still gaps there? I think these are like really important questions that we're only beginning to scratch the surface on. Okay. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about entrepreneurial strategy, and this is an area that I would say is relatively recent. I'm going to sort of broadly credit it to Josh Gans and Scott Stern and their co-authors, but there's a lot of other great work that's being done in that area. But before we go into entrepreneurial strategy, I think there's another area where we should think about it from the entrepreneur standpoint. There's sort of this question around entering entrepreneurship where there's a bit of a puzzle, or historically people had posed a bit of a puzzle, which is that, on the one hand, we know entrepreneurship is risky. It has this should have been median returns, not medium returns, low median returns, but high average returns, because you have, essentially a huge risk of failure where you get zero and then a small chance of a massive payoff. Okay, and so that kind of begs this question: is why there's so much entrepreneurship if we know people are risk averse? Okay, and one way of rationalizing this dynamic is to sort of take a dynamic perspective, a learning through experimentation perspective rather than a cross-sectional static perspective. Okay, and so in particular, if we can learn about the zero quickly and we can go back to the labor force without much of a penalty, then you actually have quite a big option value from experimenting with entrepreneurship. And Gustavo Manso has a really nice paper in the RFS on this. My colleague Chris Stanton and Nora Dillon have a paper, and then Chris Stanton and myself have a paper on this idea as well within the context of venture capital. Okay, so as we get to entrepreneurial strategy, I think I would say this is an area that is like ripe for activity, and it's sort of still kind of coalescing, and the ideas are still getting formed, and I'm still really learning and understanding and digesting this. But as I see it, one interesting idea that is coming out of this literature is that as opposed to having things that you could rank very easily as dominant versus less dominant paths, you may have a choice between multiple viable strategies to commercialize an idea. And at the same time, you can't pursue more than one alternative. So you have to commit to a path, and committing to a path unlocks certain other paths and closes others. And the question becomes, how do you sequence? And I think this is a really, really important question, because a lot of the time we tend to be very, simple in our models where we have a two-stage, we have a learn and a scale stage or whatever it might be. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of things that we need to do, and how we sequence them clearly has path dependence in the real world, and understanding that path dependence and what it allows and what it doesn't allow and how one might sequence, I think is just a really, really fascinating and important area to be thinking about further. I think the second area that I've seen sort of beginning to come out of this broader work around entrepreneurial strategy is, what are we learning when we get information back? So I test, I go out there and I test something, and what am I learning? Am I learning about the idea, or am I learning about the strategy? And this seems to me, like, for example, I go and I test, I believe that, this particular product is going to work really well with the demographic of 40 to 45-year-old males. And I go and I test it, and it turns out that I just don't get any traction. And then the question is it that my product is useless, or is it that my strategy of trying to commercialize it with 40 to 45-year-old males was wrong? And so that really brings, now brings up the role of what Agarwal, Gans, and Stern call judgment, which then stems from, what is your prior? Because what you learn from an experiment is going to be based on what your prior is. And so really relating and your prior judgment, and really understanding kind of where you believe you think based on your judgment you may want to search first or test an idea, seems like a really interesting, just a very interesting idea. And then I think related to that, I think investing in the precision of signals more generally and understanding the role of the information environment seems like just a fascinating area to be thinking about. So, how much should I know I'm getting noisy signals. How much should I invest in the precision of my signal? And how do I think about getting more precise signals on my idea versus my strategy? Can I find ways to parse those out? Does judgment come from analysis of other people's strategies in the past? And can I use that in conjunction with my experimentation to generate more informative experiments? And then I think, more broadly, kind of understanding the role of the information environment. So, do we know what the distribution of signals, like what's the underlying distribution through which we're getting signals? Are these normally distributed? Do these have fat tails? Do they maybe even have a Pareto distribution or something, kind of a sub-exponential distribution? Are the information signals distributed similarly to returns, which we know are super skewed? And so if any of these are true, it begins to impact quite considerably the way we think about how we test and how we learn from the experiments that we are undertaking. Okay, and then Kamafu et al. With Alfonso Cambadella, I have a very nice paper kind of looking at just a scientific approach to entrepreneurship, and people who have been trained to think scientifically and to actually think about the way in which they generate information signals and interpret them seem to do much better when they are kind of working through an accelerator and thinking about how to develop their product than those who haven't. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the literature on spillovers. So far we've kind of looked at three applications of experimentation. We've looked at principal agent problems. We've looked at kind of symmetric uncertainty and costs and constraints to the principal's ability to learn or experiment effectively. And then we've looked at this nascent literature on entrepreneurial strategy, where we're thinking about how best to sequence our experiments. The last thing that I'll talk about is well, of course, we're not living in isolation. There's other people out there who are running experiments, and sometimes I can learn from the actions of others engaged in similar experiments. Okay, and so Josh Krieger, my colleague, has a really nice, his job market paper was looking at, when you have a competitor in drug development that shuts down a clinical trial, how do you, as the focal drug developer, react? When is it that you choose to abandon your project, and when is it that you choose not to? And what can that tell you about what you're learning from what others are doing? Okay? And what he finds is that it's really when you have the same target and the same market where this person fails, that you are actually ironically more likely to abandon, even though you were thought from a competitive standpoint, you might be better off trying to go for it, but you basically learn from your competitors that probably this is just not going to work. They've abandoned, so I'm going to abandon as well. Okay, this is part of, this sort of learning from others is part of a broader set of research on what's called strategic experimentation in the literature and bandit problems that really thinks a lot about when you have n-armed bandits, how do you learn from what others are doing? Is there symmetric information? Is there asymmetric information? You have, this interacted with herding. So you have, you can have information cascades that arise. It's a really, rich literature that, obviously has lots of implications for entrepreneurship and innovation as well. Okay, so I think, just a quick recap here, because we've, as we kind of think about what were the design choices of these different bits of research, there's been kind of work that's looking at learning and stopping type of models. Do I abandon or continue versus, choosing between different options. There's symmetric uncertainty versus asymmetric information. There's learning from your own experiment versus outcomes from others' experiments. And then there's this focus on frictions or decision-making that's facing, the principal versus the agent. I mean, I guess I'm almost done. Let me just say that, there's all of these different design choices that people have made. And I think it's interesting to kind of consider as you read the work and kind of think, at least as I was reading and thinking about all of this, what are the dimensions that are being emphasized, what is not, how would one think about what happened if we were to kind of use a different, if we were to emphasize one of these different things. Okay, and so I think, I haven't written a slide on this new frontiers beyond the extensions because I just think I wanted to extemporate on it a little bit, which is that as we think about kind of bringing together a lot of this entrepreneurship experimentation work in entrepreneurship and innovation, one thing that seems very intriguing to me is that the methods that we are using in machine learning are building a lot on a lot of these tools around exploring versus exploiting. And that we're at the cusp of being able to get data on the choices, on these entrepreneurial decisions that people are making, in part because we can get very early into the life of companies and see what's happening in accelerators, and we can see what's happening in universities, and we can really understand in greater depth the kinds of choices that people are making, and the ways in which, and using the sort of the unstructured text that's coming from these discussions and these mentoring sessions to really begin to get more insight into, how can we be making better decisions? How can we be kind of making more effective entrepreneurial strategy? And then how should we be thinking about the various constraints that are preventing some of these big ideas from getting commercialized, and to what extent those have to do with barriers to experimentation and what we can do to address them. And so I guess I'll just leave it at that. I'd love to stick around and take questions and chat with you about what you're thinking about, but hopefully that kind of whirlwind tour was informative. And again, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to do this, because I learned a lot as I put it all together myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramana.
Thanks so much. So feel free to unmute if you have any questions. We'll stick around for a little while.
Ramana, can I ask a question?
Of course.
So when we think about experiment and learning and so on, once we start have learning, I guess a natural thing that could come out of learning is that you might learn wrong things, or there's biases during your learning, and there's mistakes and so on and so forth. Are there like things that we have that could be relevant, or is the literature developed a bit on that?
Yeah. So I think that I personally think that's a super interesting area to focus on. So in general, a lot of these models think about noisy learning versus more precise learning, right? And so a lot of the sort of the theoretical stuff is really just around kind of how do I generate that information in a more precise manner, or how do I structure an experiment in a way that generates more information for the same amount of cost. But your point is absolutely right, which is that, you know, either our choice of how to go about running this experiment, or our inability to know the environment in which we tested it, could lead to biased signals and could lead to biased results, and we may make wrong inferences from that. And I think that that is broadly related to this question of, what can we, I mean, personally, I would hope that as we make more headway in this area, that we can all, as educators and researchers, kind of develop a common set of tools and toolkits to teach our students around kind of, decision-making, entrepreneurial decision-making under uncertainty or something like this. And what are the things that you should be doing? How can you approach this in a more systematic way? What are some of the pitfalls you need to be worried about? And we can do that by literally by doing research in these areas and then learning from that and then being able to bring it to the classroom. So I think it's actually an area where there could be quite a tight link between what we do research on and what we can teach our students.
Yeah, I think this, I mean, just to very briefly follow up, sorry for taking so much time, is that I think your last point about using machine learning and computer science is actually one potential way to do that, because I think there are a lot of good programs on machine learning that can use simulated methods, for example, to test different scenarios and so on. That gives us a very effective and cheap way to actually use the machines to run this experiment for you. Yeah, just wanted to make that note. Yeah.
And you have a fun paper on that too.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Hi, Camille.
Hi. I was wondering, so how do you think like optimism, relates to experimentation? Do you think it's like a competing mechanism, or is it like, something that would cause experimentation? So what do you think about it?
Yeah, that is a really cool, it's a really cool area. I haven't done much work there, but I know that, there's one paper that comes to mind. Holger Hertz has this paper, I think with Ernst Fehr, where they're essentially, if you're too optimistic, you might underexplore, because well, it depends on what optimism there is. But if you have overconfidence in your own abilities, then you tend to underexplore. Okay, and so, but I think again here, understanding how is optimism different from overconfidence, which is different from an overconfidence in the mean versus overprecision kind of in the variance. Like, how do these things lead to how I explore differently? I think would be like, I don't know that we really know much about that, and it would be really important to know it.
Hi, Ramana. Can I ask a question?
Hey, Fabrizio, how are you?
Thank you. Fine, thank you. I wanted to ask you, how much do you think, or is there a literature that tries to measure how much uncertainty is an ingredient of success to begin with? Because there is this narrative, right, that very successful entrepreneurs are those that do things that are really outside the box. So there is the expectation that financiers know very little about their operations or the business model or the products. So there must have a lot of uncertainty about whether, you know, this new product could be successful or not.
I mean, I'll tell you what my thought on it. I don't know how much work we have on this, to be honest. But it depends a little bit on the, so if I understood your question correctly, the question is, to what extent is this idea that there is a lot of uncertainty about the value of this project a real thing versus not? Is that correct? Or no?
Yes and no. So the question is, how much is uncertainty a signal of success itself? So those projects that are very very successful, those very few projects that are very successful, are those that are most uncertain.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know that we have large-scale empirical evidence of this. What I do know is that the VCs have a following saying: everything can go to zero, only few things can go times 100. Now, that doesn't completely answer your question, but it suggests that just because something is uncertain doesn't mean it's going to have high upside. But it's possible that things that have both that have a lot of upside may be also inherently uncertain. I don't know.